Shabbat Shalom, everybody. This is Rabbi Stephen, Rav Shmuel ben Yehoshua, Rabbi Stephen Epstein, with you for this week's Devar Torah. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're enjoying the summer. I know there's been some record heat, so do what you can to keep cool. Make sure you hydrate, etc., etc. So, first of all, as some of you may have heard, we are mourning the loss of Karen Diamond. She was an 82-year-old woman who was participating in Boulder, Colorado in the march, and it was just a rally. It was a walk that these older people did to support the release of the hostages in Gaza. And of course, this guy Suleiman, came and makeshift Molotov cocktails threw it at them. A lot of these participants were burned. And unfortunately, Mrs. Diamond died of her wounds a few days ago. So we are mourning her loss. It was a tragedy, and it's just absolutely something that was just so unnecessary. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about that whole idea of what's happening to Jews these days. Because in this week's Parsha, Balak, there is a verse that kind of identifies it that I found sort of relevant to what's happening today, and I want to discuss that with you, and maybe you'll find it as relevant too. So we know the story, and the reason we know the story is because a very famous phrase in one of the verses has been integrated into our daily prayers, and that is, of course, Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. How goodly are your dwellings, O Jacob, your sanctuaries, O Israel. And it comes from three curses, or alleged curses, or anticipated curses, that God made Balaam, turn into blessings. Balaam was a wizard / prophet / magician who was summoned by a warrior king named Balak. Balak was conscripted or hired, or whatever term works here, by the Midianite and Moabite tribes because they saw Israel working their way across the wilderness and basically defeating anybody that got in their way. And they were concerned. Balak had been a warrior, and part of the midrash, part of the story that surrounds the verbiage and the Torah, discusses the fact that these tribes were scared, and they needed somebody who they thought could defeat Israel, or prevent them at least from, destroying their peoples. So Balak had proved himself in battle, and he was hired as he was made king, and they said, basically, do something. So Balak looked at this and recognized that Israel was very powerful. We were powerful warriors. And folks, we've always been powerful warriors, always. How do you think we've survived for the last 2,000 years in exile and oppression? We have always defeated our enemies. I know that you're going to say, well, what about the 10 tribes that were lost? Well, they broke the covenant with God. They reverted back to idolatry. And God said, okay, you're going to break your bargain. I'm going to break mine. It's just the way a contract works. And he did not support them. And when they were attacked by the Babylonians, the Persians, they were dispersed. Whenever we've stayed true to God, God has protected us. Yes, it's been a tough 2,000 years as we've wandered around, and we faced the Crusades, we faced the Inquisition, and of course, ultimately the Holocaust, and even the Holocaust that happened in Israel a year and a half ago. But we've always succeeded. We've always defeated our enemies. We now have our land back in the modern state of Israel, and we are a strong people. My father, in fact, is being treated by he's had some bouts of cancer. He's being treated by a vaccine created in Israel by doctors there. So we're a powerful people. And you see how Israel is taking on a lot of these aggressive nations that are trying to destroy them. We're winning. So yeah, we are a powerful people. But Balak realized that might alone is not going to defeat us. He knew that our strength was in our spirituality, as it always has been. So he thought, okay, Israel has Moses, a prophet. I need a ringer. I know this guy back from Aram or Mesopotamia named Balaam, who was a wizard, who had the ability to know when God during the day was going to be judging people, looking at what they've done wrong. And Balaam knew that people would be vulnerable as they're being judged, so that was a great time to curse him. Now, you might be asking, how is it that God allows such a prophet to exist? Well, it's not just a prophet, it's actually 70. There were 70 ancient nations, and God, we're talking about divine justice, which is fair. God's like, okay, well, if Israel has a prophet, it's only fair that all the other nations have a prophet. In fact, I submit to you that even today, God has kept his word. We have Moses, the Christians, Jesus. Islam, Mohammed, right? Look at Buddha. Buddhism has Buddha, right? So every people, every nation has had their own prophet. That's fair. That's okay. But what's not okay is when you go off and say, okay, I'm a prophet. I've got this insight that is beyond mere mortal people, and I'm going to use it. So on his way to do what King Balak, hired him to do, God intervenes and says, okay, I've told you not to go. If you insist on cursing Israel, you're not going to curse him. You're going to say what I'm going to tell you to say. And of course, the third blessing, there were three blessings. The third is the most famous. How goodly are your dwellings, O Jacob, your sanctuaries, O Israel. Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov. But let's look at the first blessing, the first curse that became a blessing. What does Balaam say? He says, Israel, and this is part of the verse 9, chapter 23, Israel is a nation apart and will dwell as a nation alone. Now, let's look back at the last 3,500 years. We have done exactly that. We have. Sometimes it's worked, most of the time, it's worked out for us. Sometimes it kind of hasn't, because when you are apart and alone, you're kind of vulnerable. So let's look at what creates anti-Semitism. Now, we know that when there are people that stand apart, they tend to be looked at kind of weirdly, right? What happens when you get a new kid at school or a new person at work? People look at the person, they start to look at faults, and God told us, no, you people you don't do that. Make an example to the world and honor the stranger, okay? Well, a lot of the world doesn't do that. They look at somebody or some nation, and sometimes in the Torah, the pronoun that they use for nation is him. It's the third person personal, because a nation is like a person. And they say that, when you see a nation apart, people tend to look at them, especially if you belong to a nation that's more numerous and, strength in numbers, then they're an easy target. But we have withstood that. Look at what's going on in this country, okay? Unfortunately, Jews have not been afforded the protection under certain civil rights laws. Some people allege that. I'll use the word alleged, because, I know some people feel differently, and that's okay. But we do stand apart. We're not considered a minority, okay? But we've kind of handled things on our own. And maybe that's part of some of the antagonism that we felt from other peoples, because we have survived, because we have been kicked out of almost every country in the world, and because we have been oppressed in very many different ways, but we've survived, and we've done more than survive. We've achieved. If you look at what Israel's doing right now, all right, they were attacked, and because we believe in peace, instead of attacking back, we've developed the Iron Dome, which allows us to neutralize any types of offenses against us, right? Israel, like I said, has developed medical technology. Look at some of the giants, Salk with his vaccine, Einstein with his theory of relativity. We stand apart. Hollywood was created by Jews. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Warner Brothers, Fox. Many actors from the 40s and 50s are Jewish. People you wouldn't think of because they changed their name because of the prejudice. So that's kind of a stark reality. But the point is that we're still a blessed nation. God has said to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, I will curse those that curse you. Now, again, this is not a carte blanche. This is not a license to kill. We have an obligation, and we've done our best to meet that obligation by being a righteous people. And we can never lose sight of that. We can never lose sight of the fact that whatever's being done, we need to be fair and we need to exercise just because God is watching. Okay, so we stand apart, but we don't stand completely apart because we believe that, Hine matovu manayim. Here is how great and wonderful it would be if we all lived together as brothers. I'll leave you with that. Shabbat shalom.